Welcome Internet to psychoanalytic talk. Today we're going to be talking about the difference between fantasy with an F and fantasy with a PH. So let me preface this by saying that this is going to be more of a discussion on semantics than anything else. It's not going to be like one of those big differential videos, but I wanted to talk about it because the differences, at least on a very base level, are quite interesting. I should also precise that a very few analysts really use a difference and really do the difference. So it's more like for your knowledge rather than something that's going to be profoundly useful to you. But nevertheless, what I like with these videos is just talking about it. So what is fantasy with an F? Well, fantasy with an F is a mental construct in which one feels something on a conscious level and pre-conscious level. For example, things like fantasizing about food, fantasizing about sex. All these representations are something you can tolerate within your ego. It's something that is not so disruptive that you cannot accept it within. So it's not something that needs repression. In a way, it's something that just flows out of the unconscious, but it's still, and that's the interesting point, it's still something that's transformed in the mind, right? It's not raw. But there's signs of transformations. There's something that are acceptable to the mind, so you can fantasize and, dare I say, daydream. That's like the basis of the word fantasy, is the daydream of what you can feel, what you can expect, so on and so forth, the pleasant moments. So, in essence, the fantasy with an F is the more superficial, it's the more baseline version of this. And for Kleinians, because it's often Kleinians that make this difference, the fantasy with a PH are the unconscious fantasies, i.e. what psychoanalysis tries to analyze. So the fantasies with a PH are those that are completely relegated to the unconscious mind. Here I have to be very precise with you. The unconscious does not mean the pre-conscious, meaning that it's not something you're vaguely aware of and you can, if you really pay attention, you can understand it. It's really something that's in your mind, but completely beyond what you can see or feel on a conscious level. It's something that's really deep down. It's not accessible like that. It needs a lot of work to really get unearthed, right? So these types of fantasies are much closer to what psychoanalysis is known for. Among them we have, of course, the Oedipus complex, because that's another big one, is that no one daydreams about having sex with their parents, right? No one. But that conscious fantasy with a PH is constructive of sorts, because it's something that pushes the individual to go through the object choice, to renounce having relationships with their parents. So that fantasy builds something that's important for the mind, i.e. a good ego and a good superego. When it's stopped, when it's prevented, when it's frustrated, it builds upon it. And all these fantasies are a bit of the same. For example, a very good one also would be the fantasy to return that's French, retourner, return to the womb. So that fantasy of returning to the womb is also something that is very unconscious in nature. It's not something that you think about. For example, when you're in a pool and enjoying swimming, or if you're in bed, you're not consciously thinking to yourself, God, yes, this is a womb experience, right? But if we were to analyze it in a psychoanalytic way, that's exactly what it is. It's you feeling a moment of regression where sensorially you're going back to that fantasy. And it's an unconscious fantasy of going back to the very first stages of life. And Harry Guntrip, in The Schizoid Phenomena, Objects, Relations, and the Self, analyzes it incredibly well in the context of the schizoid personality. Now, there's plenty like really plenty of fantasies, both with an F and with a PH. One of the main reasons why these distinction did not, I think, hold too well with time is that I think that for most analysts it's a continuum. Like, yes, your conscious fantasies are more superficial and in the context of the mind, like they cut off from part of the unconscious mind. They're making them less like intense, but still, it's still like a direct link. Like, for example, there's a bit missing, but you can see where it's going, right? In the same way that fundamentally both are a similar process. It's just that one gets to float to the conscious mind and be accepted by it, whereas the other one gets pushed down by the conscious mind because it's too complicated for our identity, our egocentric identities, to accept what is happening. Of course, I talked a lot about sexuality, but you should keep in mind it's also about aggression. Like all the fantasies about destroying, about ripping out parts of the body, so on and so forth, all those things are of an unconscious nature. Often people are not really conscious of it. And even people that act in terrible ways often split, and they're not always aware of the horrors they commit. Like their mind separates it and it's pushed back into the unconscious. Sometimes it remains conscious, but you get what I mean. So that's, as I said, it's a very interesting distinction. However, it's not something that is employed nowadays. Like everyone uses fantasy F and like for everything. This includes the Lacanians that don't make a difference, or the pure Freudians that also don't make a difference. Also, certain analysts in, like, I would say before the 40s, used both virtually interchangeably. So when I explained all of this, you have to keep it in the context that it was at some point someone tried to make a difference. I think those people were the Kleinians, but it's a difference that didn't really hold too much in the context of history. However, I felt that it was interesting to talk about it because I think that distinction is still quite relevant, as a fantasy, a conscious fantasy, I think, in nature is very different from an unconscious fantasy with a pH that's very intense and something that is unacceptable for the mind. And I think that by differentiating both of them, we can create a framework in which fantasy with an F is something that's more accessible. It's a first step in a process to try and uncover the fantasies PH that are underlying in the unconscious mind and are still very unconscious. So there's also the whole discussion of how do we get to unearth the fantasies with a PH. Well, those fantasies, because of the highly disruptive nature, are quite complicated to extract and need a lot of time and a lot of trust between the clinician and the patient in order to be able to really become fully aware and fully conscious of them. You also run the risk of being a bit lost in the unconscious fantasies, as there's a lot of things that goes through the Oedipus complex to the original scene, i.e. the moment the individual was conceived by their own parents, the womb, and you get so many. So like it's not like easy process where there's an protocol you can use to really get to the end of the end. You never really get to the end, but it's like what is useful can also be a very interesting question. Some unearthing of some fantasies PH might be very helpful for the patient, might be very also of use for their minds in order to free them and make them more aware and at ease with who they are. And other fantasies might be so disruptive that they're not worth unearthing. I should also say that you have to be very, very careful when working with this material of unconscious fantasies PH, because they have an unconscious nature, meaning that the conscious mind is not ready for them. not without massive preparation and massive trust from both patient and therapist. Also, and it's very important, you cannot project what you've read in books to patients. Even though you might have the intuition that it's that, and it very well might be that. That intuition is very important. You should keep it in mind. But you shouldn't force it upon the patient. It's not like, oh, well, I think you have I don't know, let's say I think you suffer from your Oedipus complex. You're not going to force that on the patient. Oh, yeah, so it's because you want to have a close encounter with X or Y, which were your parents, and so on and so forth. You can't force it upon the patient. The patient has to bring it softly and gently out of the unconscious mind. As forcing it out is taking the risk, A, of weakening the ego of the patient, meaning that their sense of identity will become vulnerable because you've unearthed something that's so deep and so massive that they can't deal with it right now. And it's not advised to just say something as massive to a patient, even though the clients did direct interpretations on the unconscious mind. Nowadays, I think that you have to have people that are all very prepared for that, like they know exactly what they're getting into, or people that have worked on themselves so long that they have no qualms with such ideas. But someone that's just coming here for, let's say, a mild depression often needs a lot of work in order to be even able to accept that at our core there are things that we fantasize about and have an influence on us, but that are not something that's, how can I say, valuable socially. It's not something that fits well within the conscious mind. It's something that breaks the conscious mind even. So you have to be very, very careful. So you can't project what you've read, what you personally think onto the patient. It has to be built with the patient. The patient has to agree with that, has to be very prepared for it. And that's also, I think, one of the reasons why that difference never really stuck, is that it's easier to just slip in the continuum of fantasy with an F and to sometimes not even touch fantasies with a PH. I know that was also all the rage of early psychoanalysis, trying to get to the deepest of the deepest end for the patient. But nowadays it's much less about that. It's more about symptom management, about trying to understand, having introspection. So those unconscious fantasies, I think, as a clinician, are very interesting because they're important to keep in mind, but they're not necessarily the end game of analysis, at least not nowadays. What is more the end game of analysis is to have a patient be able to live his life in the least suffering, with the least suffering possible. To paraphrase Freud, what we are aiming to is have them come from a neurotic form of suffering to a normal form of suffering. And I think that's really the top of the pops of what we can do to help the patient. Afterwards, all the other stuff, like all the in-depth analysis, is so interesting and so great to do, but it takes real commitment from both parties and real engagement into what is going to happen. So that's pretty much it for this distinction between fantasies with a F and fantasies with a PH. I hope you found the video useful and entertaining. I'll also link to debates of people who have talked about these types of things. And if you have any questions or anything you'd like to ask, please feel free to leave a comment. I'll see you in the next one.